Yesterday, you heard about the insurrectionist attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, and how it was not spontaneous, but rather coordinated, posted in plain sight on social media platforms and online forums. The conversation you just heard was about the spectrum of online radicalization and how misinformation can turn into hardened conspiracy theories that can escalate to more extremist ideologies and then violence. Policymakers, law enforcement, civil society groups, and private industry, especially the tech platforms, have sought to confront this challenge and the conditions that give rise to extremist movements. Doing so has also required a reckoning with the power of online radicalization, which enables decentralized extremist movements to quickly grow their ranks and incite episodes of real-world violence. Like many of the other challenges that we've talked about here at 360 OS, it is a global challenge. Extremism isn't a monolith, and especially online, we see many drastically different ideologies that lend themselves to different kinds of extremism. In this conversation, we will use many different examples, and I want to be very clear with our audience that we will not be drawing equivalence between those various examples. I'm really excited to be joined by colleagues Mary McCord, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown, as well as a former senior U.S. Department of Justice official. Nick Rasmussen, who is the current Executive Director of the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, as well as the former Director of the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center. Amy Spitalnick, who is currently the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, and Rachel Gillum, an affiliated scholar with Stanford University and DFR Lab non-resident fellow. So first and foremost, this is a conversation. It's good to see all of you. For those of you that are tuning in to this conversation online or on Socio, don't hesitate to send any questions. This is truly a conversation with us, and I will incorporate them in. But going to the first question, how has the internet affected this challenge of domestic violent extremism? And what are the links between online engagement and radicalization? When does that actually, are there any indicators, hard indicators for when that turns to violence? We'll go around the horn for this first question. First over to you, Amy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and so wonderful to be with this incredible panel. Look, I don't think we can overstate the impact of the internet and of social media when it comes to violent extremism. In so many ways, social media has become the clan den of the 21st century. And in the past, you had white supremacists and other extremists that would gather in their specific geographic areas, Klansmen sitting in the woods in their white hoods, and their violence and their extremism would be limited to their specific geographic area. But now we see extremists who are able to connect not just across the country, but around the globe, engage, radicalize, plan violence, and inspire others to action. So understanding how that ecosystem works is central to the work of my organization, Integrity First for America, because that ecosystem was at the core of the violence that unfolded in Charlottesville 4 years ago. And we are taking to court the 24 individuals and hate groups responsible for orchestrating that violence. I think we all remember watching in horror as neo-Nazis and white supremacists stormed an American city, violently attacking people based on their race, their religion, their willingness to defend the civil rights of others. It was truly a weekend of violence that culminated in the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured so many others. And what's important to understand, much like with the Capitol attack and so many other attacks that we've seen in recent years, is that the violence that weekend wasn't an accident. Rather, it was planned meticulously in advance via social media and other forums, most notably on Discord, which I suspect many viewers of this conference use as they play video games or otherwise engage with their own social networks. And on these Discord forums, there were countless channels in which the defendants in our lawsuit, the leaders of the Charlottesville violence, planned everything from the mundane and banal, what to wear, what to bring for lunch, how do they best sew a swastika on a flag, to the vile and the violent. How can they use free speech instruments to attack people, and whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is of course precisely what happened. And so we are taking to court, as I mentioned, 24 leaders and hate groups that conspired to attack Charlottesville through this racist, violent conspiracy. The basis of our lawsuit is a statute called the Ku Klux Klan Act that was crafted 150 years ago specifically to protect against this sort of racist, violent conspiracy. And I don't think that when it was signed into law by President Grant, it was ever expected to deal with racist, violent conspiracies that happened on something called social media or the internet. But the fact that this 150-year-old statute is sadly so relevant in this day and age, and that we're talking about so many of the same sorts of extremism and violent conspiracies just now happening and being planned on social media where they have exponentially larger reach is quite powerful. The last thing I'll say is that this didn't end with Charlottesville and it didn't end with the Capitol. We see how this cycle of violence continues in which each attack inspires the next. We know that, for example, some of the Charlottesville leaders communicated with the Pittsburgh shooter before his attack on Tree of Life congregation there that killed 11. The Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in 2 mosques there, donated to 2 of our Charlottesville defendants, and painted onto his gun a white power symbol that had been popularized by a 3rd Charlottesville leader. Christchurch was live streamed on Facebook and in turn seemed to inspire the Poway attack at Chabad there 2 years ago, the El Paso Walmart attack, and of course the connections and the parallels, the ways in which the playbook continued with the Capitol, the use of social media to plan and execute this sort of violence is clear. And so I think in order to understand this crisis of extremism that we're facing in this country, we have to be clear-eyed about the central role of social media and the internet. And to break that cycle, we need to recognize that we can't do it without addressing the role of the internet and social media.
And Mary McCord, this is something that you've been incorporating into your work at ICAP in particular over the last year, and especially with domestic violent extremism movements in the United States and how that relates to potential legal interventions. But you've also, done an enormous amount of work on more of the international elements of the same vulnerability space or threat space. How crucial is that online information environment to the evidentiary standards for your work, and how do you incorporate that in?
Right. So, when I was still in government, I was, in leadership of the National Security Division from May 2014, 1 month before ISIS declared a caliphate, until May of 2017, at which time their physical control of land had been severely diminished. They still had a real influence globally, but we were also seeing domestically here a rise in domestic extremist violence and domestic terrorism incidents, and we were seeing it interconnected with other domestic extremists around the world. And you might think, well, that sounds weird to say domestic extremists around the world. And really, those terms are not very useful anymore because there's no one brand of extremism that sort of stops at the borders of any country. There's just different ideologies that are shared in many cases globally. And when we tend to talk about domestic extremism in the United States, we tend to often be talking about anti-government or white supremacist motivated extremism. And that's something, of course, that goes beyond the US borders. But to get directly to your question, Graham, whether battling international extremism or domestic extremism, the impact of social media has been so great for all the reasons that Amy pointed out, but it also has been a key part of the evidentiary standard used not only in criminal prosecutions, but also, as Amy indicated, in civil suits. And in fact, my organization also brought a civil suit after Charlottesville, which resolved successfully a couple of years ago with court-ordered injunctive relief against a number of white supremacist and militia organizations. But what we see is that online planning, plotting, and often the recording of the event itself is often at times a very, very critical part of evidence. And I think we're seeing that right now as we see prosecutors in the US put together over 500 cases against the insurrectionists who attacked the Capitol on January 6th. The volume of video evidence, photographic evidence, selfies, individual statements posted by the defendants themselves on social media, these are all admissions that can be used against them in trial. And so it's an incredible incredible use to extremists to plot, but it's also can be their downfall, because it also allows the government and civil litigants to be able to prove cases against them. I also want to address one thing you asked in your original question about, are there any markers on that sort of path of radicalization to violence? How do you know when something's just, rhetoric online versus going to translate into violence on the street? And obviously, if there was any, surefire marker for that, that would be terrific. There isn't, but I think there's something that I saw both in the international terrorism sphere and the domestic terrorism sphere that I think is really critical, which is that there comes a time, and we saw this with ISIS, when the conversations or the shared information went beyond, general rhetoric or propaganda about the goals of ISIS and into logistical planning, right? How do I get to Syria from Connecticut, right? And where do I go in Turkey is the best crossover to Syria? That's when you start seeing that logistical planning that shows you somebody's about ready to do something. We saw that before the insurrection. We saw all kinds of talk about stop the steal. We saw all kinds of talk about the need to stop the steal, to ensure that the previous president could remain the president and to undermine the peaceful transition of power. But when we actually started seeing people talking about rally points to convoy together to Washington, D.C., hotels to stay in, things like that, that's when this isn't just talk anymore. These are people who are actually planning to come to Washington, D.C. and to prevent the counting of the Electoral College vote.
And much of that planning exists online, right? In open forums, much to your point, Mary, what hotel are you staying at? Or should we bring X, Y, or Z to Washington, D.C. to do this thing at this time? That's an evidentiary standard that most people don't think of. They think of as content, a single post of content that is posted on the internet, as opposed to something that could potentially be incriminating, or more so something to get ahead of. And so, Nick, over to you. In Amy's first response, she mentioned the Christchurch shooter. In your work, again, truly global, and working directly with platforms as well as governments to try to get ahead of this challenge. But in your view, the global internet forum to counter terrorism, how does the online space play into your day-to-day work? How does that impact it?
Thanks, Brandon, and it's great to be on this panel with distinguished colleagues. I think picking up where both Amy and Mary started the conversation, I think of what we're dealing with as an online ecosystem or an online environment that serves in many ways as a catalyst or an accelerant to the spread of violent extremism and potentially terrorism. What that online environment allows for is just a much more simple and available form of engagement for individuals with radical ideologies that ultimately potentially have a violent outlet to them. Now, it gets much harder to pinpoint when that point comes, when someone crosses over from simply being a consumer, a propagator, a dabbler, someone who is engaging in that extremist conversation, and then, as Mary says, gets logistical all of a sudden and starts to think about, how do I make this actually happen? And I think we are not yet at the point, at least I don't feel like the scholarship has put us in a position where we can be adequately predictive in that space. I guess my own initial sense, though, in thinking about this is the more that the rhetoric engaged in, the more that the narrative of the individual in that online environment is truly apocalyptic or speaks to existential threat to their own being, their own sense of safety, the more likely it is they are to revert or to resort to that violence tool. When it goes something that has gone beyond an infringement on my rights or liberties and instead is something that is now existential or threatening to my way of life, then of course it seems logical or natural to assume that violence as a response is not only necessary, but justified. So I guess I would point to that as one lens through which you could look at to kind of think about how to be predictive in this space. Briefly speak, Graham, to what you highlighted my work with GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And again, if you flash back to 2017, when GIFCT was created by companies, 4 founding companies in the technology sector, to deal with the problem of online extremism, online violent extremism, online terrorism, at that point, the problem set really was one that was predominantly focused on international terrorism, dealing with ISIS, dealing with Al-Qaeda, that form of extremism or terrorism on the internet. Clearly, the problem set is a much broader, more diverse problem set today. And the companies that are engaged in my work at GIFCT understand that. And we need to find ways to be collaborative and sharing with each other, not only information, but best practices, tools, techniques, technical knowledge in ways that allow us as partners in an effort with government and civil society to do a much better job of making the online environment safe and healthy. And that is something that I don't see as happening overnight. But what I'm happy about is that we're engaged in a multi-stakeholder conversation that brings everybody to the table with the same set of motivations. I'll stop there. Look forward to hearing from Rachel and then jumping back into the other sets of questions that you have.
Well, and to your point, Nick, I mean, this is truly a collective challenge. And Rachel, you've looked at this challenge from many different aspects of the groups that would be involved, whether from academia, from a policymaking standpoint, private sector standpoint. How do you see those groups coming together, as well as the original question, how is this challenge of violent extremism impacted or accelerated by online ecosystems, as Nick put it?
Yeah, no, great question. And thank you again for having me today on this great panel. So as you mentioned, I'm coming at this issue area as an academic who has studied violent extremism and counter-extremism strategies for several years. And my recent book tries to put empirical data to these type of questions, as a lot of this work has largely been guided by sort of anecdotal evidence. And also I work to try to put some of these, concerns around extremism into greater context. So just as the other panelists said, the online environment certainly does play a role in what we're seeing today. We see it allows for individuals to, share extremist speech and actually receive positive feedback often, rather than the social sanctioning that they could face in the real world. And this is further amplified because individuals can engage anonymously if they choose. They can find more like-minded individuals than they would otherwise. And it also allows a small set of individuals to have an outsized impact on the conversation and reach a much wider audience, as others have mentioned. So we know that research shows that a lot of extreme content on social media actually involves a fairly small number, but of very frequent users who are responsible for this content. So it can often seem much more widespread than it really is and have a large impact. And, to that question of this link between online engagement and radicalization, just as Nick mentioned, the data is not clear. From a social science perspective, we have some mixed evidence on sort of where this stands. We have studies that, for example, note that local organizing remains the primary recruitment tool for the far right movement, for example. But of course, online platforms can facilitate and support the organization of local events. It can augment physical gatherings once individuals have met in person. So there's at very least a supporting role there of the online environment. And then there's studies that go so far as to say that there's actually a causal link between online speech and offline behavior. We saw this in a recent study coming out of Germany that linked Facebook anti-refugee sentiment with actual hate crimes and showed a causal mechanism there. So even with these type of studies, there's still a lot more work to do to figure out, again, precisely what inspires an individual to go from extreme speech and engagement with this material to actually acting in the real world.
Well, and this is so challenging because there's a lot of juxtaposition in all of those answers, right? There's a lot of tension in all of those answers, in which we're in this situation where we have, to some of the earlier answers point, more information than we've had about this specific vulnerability than ever before. But much to Rachel's point, it's in many cases highly contextualized, or on a case-by-case basis, in which we can draw some conclusions, but not all conclusions. How do we as a community, how does the audience, who does an enormous amount of research and work on this topic in particular, navigate that space? Nick, I know that GIFCT is working on a broader taxonomy in order to make more of that information more available. I guess the question to the wider group, starting with Nick, is do we have enough information? Are we storing it in and striking the balance between removing harmful content from online spaces and preserving it to better understand this threat space in a way that is safe, effective, and can draw not contextualized conclusions, but comprehensive conclusions?
So Graham, not surprisingly, complex answer to complex question. If our only objective as a society was to rid the internet of extreme violent speech or what you might classify as speech tied to terrorism, we could of course achieve that. You would have over moderation of content either by the government or by companies themselves. But that of course isn't our only objective. Our objective is also to have a free, open internet that allows for the exchange of ideas across all issues, and doesn't just assume that the only conversations that matter on the internet are the ones that we're talking about today. So arriving at that kind of balanced place where you are in a position to address content that is likely to lead to violence or has led to violence, while not doing so in such a heavy-handed way that you have created a significant violation of fundamental human rights in the process, that's the sweet spot we're aiming for. And so companies that come to the table in the GIFCT context to address this problem, they have to make two affirmations when they show up to do this work with us. One is a commitment to moderate content and address issues on their platform that involve terrorism and violent extremism. Okay, straightforward enough. They also commit to doing so within the context of a respect for fundamental human rights. And that's an equally important part of our mission and mandate at GIFCT, to make sure that we don't achieve one societal objective at the expense of another one that I hold equally dear, and I know my fellow panelists do as well.
Thanks so much. And maybe to Mary or Amy, who have built legal cases based on this type of material or content online, is there enough from a case-by-case basis, or do you feel like there are gaps in what would be useful in order to A, be preventative, or B, create cases to create consequences for this type of behavior?
Well, just putting first on my counterterrorism hat, I mean, generally speaking, I would rather see less of this content on major platforms, even if it means there'll be less available to prosecutors and civil litigants, because deplatforming terrorist and extremist content, I think, is more impactful than individual one-off lawsuits, probably overall. And even though it is true that those who truly want to communicate will move to other platforms, maybe platforms that don't moderate their content, the fact is those other platforms have a higher barrier to entry. I mean, Facebook is so easy, Twitter is so easy. The main platforms are so ubiquitous, anyone can use them, anyone does use them around the world of all ages. But when a person then says, oh, I can't see my local militia page on Facebook, I have to go to mymilitia.com. I don't know what that is. I'm not going to go there. I mean, that will happen. There's just a drop off of people who are willing to take that extra step to learn a new platform, maybe become a member of it, maybe to get vetted, and they're just not going to do it. So, my vote is still, less of that extremist content will have a greater impact on, cabining the global spread of some of the types of disinformation that become the catalyst for extremist action and extremist violence. And so, so when it comes though to actual, a time to maybe bring a case, whether it's a prosecution or a civil case, I mean, being able to get the cooperation of the platforms to seek access to and authentication of that content is very useful. And I can just give you one example, and I'm not going to name the providers' names, but we're litigating a case against an unlawful militia in in New Mexico right now, and there's content that was taken down that we're being told is nowhere to be found. It was taken down. Well, I have a hard time believing that even when it was taken down, it is not available somewhere. In fact, I just don't believe it. And so maybe the technical people on here will correct me on that. But I just think that's just an example of not cooperating, because many of the platforms, when they take content down, they also do promise to provide an appeal mechanism. So you're not going to take it down and throw it in the actual true rubbish bin where it's not able to be retrieved if you're going to give somebody an appeal right to potentially put that content back up. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well for the providers to, you know, be public service minded when it comes to cooperation with prosecutions and with civil litigants. You know, and that's on, I hate using the word on both sides, but that's on both sides, right? And they are players in this area, and you know, they are subject to subpoenas and legal process.
I don't have much to add to everything Mary said, and I wholeheartedly agree on her point that that I would much rather see these platforms take down violent extremist content than have to bring a lawsuit like the one my organization brought, or like the one that Mary brought, right? There's real value in limiting the audience to which these extremists can speak. And we see that as we gradually shrink the audiences to which they have access, it has very real impacts. And you don't have to just take it from me. For example, in our case, Richard Spencer, who until not that long ago was the country's leading neo-Nazi, said that this case has financially crippled him, and he can't go about his business. He can't continue to build out these events and raise money because he's been deplatformed from a number of the major social media sites. And so when a leading neo-Nazi is telling you that deplatforming has an impact on his ability to plan the sorts of racist, violent events like we saw in Charlottesville, that's meaningful, that's impactful. And there's no obligation by a social media company to give a platform to someone like Richard Spencer to plan something like Unite the Right, which was always intended to be violent, as Mary and our lawsuit have both explicitly detailed. And so I just want to put a fine point on that. You don't have to take it from us. You hear it from these extremists and clearly limit their audience, their ability to recruit and to bring people into this violence and to, of course, inspire others to action. It can have very real impacts.
That makes a tremendous amount of sense. One thing that stuck out is the note on cross-platform activity, and where we see a lot of instances of either harmful content or calling for coordination, calling for violence online, the lack of indicators for when that actually means that they are going to do, that a violent extremist act will happen. And one question that stuck out based on Mary's response is, when you see an actor or a user take an action by jumping from one platform to another after something like deplatforming, is that an indicator that they will do other actions potentially? And then second to that, I'll pull in a question that we just got from the audience on Socio, and I'll read it verbatim. The research community, including DFR Lab, have documented a decrease in extremist organizing on more mainstream platforms, while these groups have reorganized on smaller forums or have recultivated on smaller forums or through encrypted applications. How will that change in communication infrastructure impact the work that this collective group does? Maybe I could turn to Rachel first on the first part of that question, which is indicators for action. Does jumping across platforms, noting that this is a collective challenge that doesn't happen on just one place in the internet, is that a fairly good indicator for potentially more action?
Yeah, it's a good question, but as an academic, I don't think I can say that the data necessarily support that as a decisive, indicator. But to the second question, just as Mary and others were mentioning, is that the online forum, it does benefit groups again in their ability to connect across and very effectively and coordinate. But, as Mary mentioned, it also can benefit law enforcement and their ability to identify and monitor some of these communities. And We do see this distrust and fear of infiltration in these online conversations, not knowing who's who, which makes it more difficult for them to coordinate. And then as we just discussed, of course, we see folks moving to these encrypted conversations and platforms that limits law enforcement's capabilities to observe. But it also, just as was just said, limits the speed to which these extremist movements can access large audience and grow their movement and expand fundraising. So there's pros and cons on both sides. But what we do know from studying other extremist movements is the folks that sort of do remain and do persist, right, on these more narrow platforms tend to be more extreme, and we tend to see more violence from them. So while the group is smaller, unfortunately, there is a high risk among those individuals.
Graham, can I jump in there as well?
Of course.
One of the important points I think you made with your question, and Rachel kind of hinted at also, is this diversification goes even beyond what we typically think of in terms of social media platforms. What may have started as primarily a social media phenomenon some years ago with extremist engagement online is now a phenomenon that includes extremist engagement across many different forms of internet services. So you end up with extremist individuals or violent extremist groups using file sharing services or web storage services, or to just simply say acknowledge what was in the New York Times after January 6th, where it was noted that Airbnb services have been exploited by individuals coming to Washington, D.C. for the insurrection events. What that tells me as someone involved with GIFCT is that we need to be involving a much wider swath of technology companies in this effort. Obviously, a company like Facebook or Twitter has equipped itself over time to have content moderation services, hiring the best terrorism and counterterrorism experts they can, putting in place expensive content moderation capabilities. If you're one of these other companies and you wake up one day and find your platform, your service being exploited, you may not be as well equipped to address these problems as you might want to be. And you've got to crawl up that learning curve pretty rapidly. And then going back to something you said in your introduction to me, Graham, global is the first word in Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And while we're in this conversation largely thinking about this through the lens of January 6th or Charlottesville as Americans, what we're talking about is also an environment globally where extremism can move across these platforms. So what good are we doing if we solve the problem in Silicon Valley and don't solve the problem, or at least address the problem on platforms that are being widely used by individuals in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, across the broader Middle East. So that's, again, not to make the problem harder and more complex, but each of those geographic regions has preferred applications, preferred social media platforms, all of them are being exploited by terrorists and violent extremists as well.
One of the pretty consistent themes is that there are no particularly straightforward answers to this challenge, which is coming through in spades during this session for sure. Because we've worked on disinformation quite a bit, one question about disinformation is the relationship between disinfo, whether it's offline or online, especially accelerated online or happening at scale online. How does that play into the radicalization process and the radicalization process leading into potential violent extremism? I'll point out one example that is an international example. One of the narratives that we heard consistently during the rise of ISIS or ISIL was that if you traveled to Syria on a one-way plane ticket, much like Mary mentioned before, you would arrive at a utopia. And a lot of these narratives of strength and warmth as opposed to extreme violence were some of the most engaged and appealing online, and transitioned some who engaged with ideology but weren't moved to action actually to taking that step of buying a plane ticket or moving to action. And so the key question here is, how does disinformation, I'm sure that we could come up with 1,000 other examples, fuel the radicalization process, and what can be done about that? potentially going to Amy first.
Sure. I think you're right. Like we could talk about 1,000 different examples here. One of the first examples that comes to mind for me is last summer, we saw an alarming rise in violence around, of course, the Black Lives Matter protests writ large, but specifically an alarming rise in various extremist activity as it related to disinformation being pushed out there about Antifa or Black Lives Matter. And one of the examples that comes to mind for me is that one of the defendants in our lawsuit, a group that is now called the American Identitarian Movement, but Identity Europa is their former name, very engaged in propaganda on college campuses and other propaganda disinformation sorts of efforts. They specifically posed as Antifa on social media, encouraging violence in white neighborhoods around the Black Lives Matter protests, intended to, of course, rile various people up, various different groups up. And then you actually saw armed far right, I don't know if they were militia members or just officially or otherwise, show up in hopes of defending their communities, quote unquote, against Antifa. And so you see the very real world consequences of a disinformation campaign, even if it's as simple as a couple tweets from a white supremacist group posing as a far left group. And that's, of course, incredibly dangerous. Of course, between Kyle Rittenhouse and a number of other incidents last summer, we see, of course, the ways in which far-right extremism then manifested in the face of these racial justice protests. I think it's also worth pointing out something that is in many ways equally dangerous, which is the more subtle disinformation campaigns. And we're seeing this play out right now. Campaigns that are intended to ultimately change the narrative and rewrite the history of racism and extremism and other factors in our country. Of course, we're right now having this huge, I don't even want to call it a debate because there's no debate to be had, but this insane conversation about critical race theory, which has been used as this red herring by extremists, not just actual extremists, but also far-right politicians and increasingly mainstream figures with the ultimate goal of effectively undermining our reality, undermining the facts. And we see this then manifest in how a number of white supremacists and others are talking about this. The defendants in our lawsuit are out there on white supremacist podcasts talking about how their goal is to, quote, dismantle the Charlottesville narrative and how they don't want Heather Heyer's murder in Charlottesville to be, quote, they called it a stupid cliche like Selma. And so the goal with these campaigns isn't simply to cause immediate violence and tension and other issues. It's also to ultimately shift the narrative on these bigger pictures, which of course then creates much larger tensions, the potential for much larger violence. Of course, the Capitol insurrection being the perfect example of that after years and years of disinformation around voter fraud and the election and whatnot. And so I think it's important to recognize that we're not just talking about sort of direct disinformation campaigns that are obvious to people like us, but also these more subtle campaigns that have much longer term but equally dangerous goals.
If the understanding is collective, another way to ask that question directly is, does limiting disinformation related to violent extremism limit the potential on-ramps to radicalization as well as the space for potentially violent acts to be coordinated online? Potentially going to marry in the context of January 6th and any other examples that the group assembled might think of.
Yeah, well, so, you know, kind of building off of Amy's comment and trying to address your direct question, Graham, you know, the extremists don't act just based on nothing, right? They have to have some sort of ideology that's not just ideology globally, but that's, you know, some grievance that they're acting on. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that those grievances might change quite a bit. And the last 18 months, we saw a morphing of the grievances that provided a coalescing narrative for extremists across a pretty wide spectrum. Extremists that I think otherwise would adhere to ideologies that are overlapping but slightly different, right? Some are more direct anti-government. Some are more, you know, white supremacists in their core ideology. Some are more anarchists, slightly different than anti-government, but anarchist. But we saw all these coming together, and we saw it through first, opposition to government-ordered pandemic-related health orders, and we saw it through, attacks on state houses in opposition to shutdown orders, and later attacks on the mask mandate, and a false narrative that the pandemic was a hoax, and that mask mandates and shutdown orders were just infringements on civil liberties brought about by, far leftist governments. Then after the George Floyd murder, we saw, as Amy so eloquently described, the racial justice demonstrations that created a new narrative for white supremacists and anti-government extremists and anarchists to say, oh, now we are called upon to go defend our property, defend our history, our statues, etc., against violent anarchists. So that brought together about some of the same groups. And then as the election, came to be in November, and then even post-election, this narrative of election fraud and a stolen and rigged election provided yet a whole new coalescing force for these groups, which culminated in January 6th. But a lot of the groups were the same groups. They just found this, the issue of the day was what caused them to take action on, April through May 31st, then a new issue for a couple months. And now we still have the stolen election narrative. We still have some anti-pandemic, public safety measures types of ideologies that are coalescing forces. But now we also have this sort of, let's make critical race theory the bogeyman and the new ideology we all have to coalesce around. And so I think it's important that, it might not always be obvious to recognize these for what they are in terms of how significant they can be when they first start surfacing online, because frankly, some of them seem so far out and ridiculous. I think many of us would think that won't catch on, but never be too surprised about what can catch on in the, wild, wild west of the internet, where people will believe just about anything. And so I think you're right that if there were less of that incoming, there might be fewer people who decide to respond to it, adhere to it, and coalesce around it. But, I don't want to be looking like I'm the one saying, we should be, doing heavy content restrictions. I do respect First Amendment rights. Private platforms are not governed by the First Amendment. Let's be clear, they can moderate any content they want, but they also respect the free marketplace of ideas and the general principles behind our First Amendment. So I think it's a balance there in figuring out, disinformation, does it serve any real purpose in that free marketplace of ideas? Is it something that could actually lead to potential extremist violence? Those are the kind of things that need to be thought about much earlier in the process.
Well, and that poses a great question as we come to some of the final questions of this conversation. Very few experts, even those infinitely familiar with internet culture and domestic extremism, could have ever predicted the rise of QAnon, for example, 5 years ago. And so how do we, what makes us the most nervous? And I understand the dangers of this question and trying to get a little bit too predictive in this space in generally. What makes us the most nervous over the next 5 years? What do we need to be predictive and planning for right now? Over to Nick to start that off.
Oh, great, thanks. I guess one of the things I think has made the problem we're talking about so difficult over the last several years is the way in which these toxic ideas can accelerate, bounce off of each other, and accelerate even further and faster. As you pointed out earlier, Graham, it's not as if misinformation, disinformation is new or is a new contributor to extremism. I was talking to one of my GIFCT colleagues today, Dr. Erin Saltman, who reminded me, when I told her about this panel, she reminded me that the Taliban were anti-vax before anti-vax was cool. That was a part of their narrative as they looked at the West and portrayed the West in a certain way. So anti-vax didn't just show up in the context of domestic American politics right now. My point being, though, that what has changed things is the acceleration and the literally the speed at which these ideas can traffic. And I think we have to assume that whatever we're dealing with in that environment now, you can put a couple of exponents on top of that over the next 5 to 10 years. And so how we deal with that virality and that accelerationism, I think is probably one of our biggest challenges. Because even if you want to do the right things, if you're a company or a government, how do you do them fast enough to prevent the harmful effects from getting beyond your control before you can act?
And over to Rachel, building on that question, is there something from the academic field that would be most helpful that's just not in the current research or practitioner field that would be helpful over the next 5 years?
Well, I'll just add to the comments here that, thinking about QAnon specifically and what we might expect in the coming years, as we've discussed, after January 6th, we've seen some reports that there's been some disillusionment with QAnon. Some have turned away by a sense of failure or fear of punishment, or even just disagree with how extreme things got. But as we mentioned earlier, based on what we know about other extremist movements in the past, is that we can expect the true believers who do remain potentially and unfortunately to become more intolerant and rigid and potentially violent. And in fact, we saw the FBI released a warning earlier this month that they actually expect for the remaining QAnon believers to potentially become even more violent. They mention a shift, that folks don't believe they can continue to trust the plan and that they have to take even greater control over the direction of the movement. And so we've seen some evidence that, again, the targets of this group may continue to be high-level politicians, Democrats specifically, members of Congress. And so I think those are things we'll need to, look out for.
And final question to the entire group. We've talked a lot about this as a collective challenge that involves government and media and civil society, the tech platforms. But do they have the tools, and perhaps focusing specifically most of all on government as entities and free and open societies that are ultimately responsible for security? Do they have the tools, expertise, and strategy to understand and incorporate into their decision-making the online nexus to violent extremism? Beginning with Mary. As someone who I've had the pleasure of
So, when I was in government, we used an all tools approach as a descriptor for how we brought all the tools of government to bear in our counterterrorism endeavor and our general national security endeavor. And I adhere to that approach, but I do think we need tools beyond government tools. I'm now sort of more in favor of the all tools of society approach and not just all tools of government. And I don't think we ever meant it to be exclusive to government before, but I think that's how it oftentimes was centered. And I'll be curious Nick's thoughts about that, as we were around the same table many times together in the past administration. But I do think that there's a lot of expertise outside of government, particularly when we are talking about the tech sector, to be drawn upon. The researchers and what they are able to do is different than what government law enforcement investigators are able to do. Researchers are not constrained by the same constitutional requirements and other statutory requirements that private researchers are, private researchers are not constrained by. And so, there's ample room for bringing, I think, a whole of government, whole of society approach. And I think we also need to think about even a bigger picture, right? A broader approach to sort of what are some of the grievances and the structural problems within the US that lead to the grievances that lead to extremism. And that also can apply in the international sphere. And if we only take care of the one part of this, like how do we deal with the extremism, and we don't deal with, well, what about the grievances that lead to that? vulnerability to extremism, then we're never going to actually solve a problem long term. And so these are the big questions that have been surfaced over the last year and a half and beyond within the US, things that have to do with structural and systemic racism in our institutions, whether we're talking about financial, educational, housing, criminal justice, etc. And I don't mean to get too off topic, but I mean, when we talk about whole of society, these things all do come into play when we talk about extremism. And so I think we have to, really open our eyes and look really broadly about what are all the different levers that can be pulled to advance combating this problem.
Thanks so much. And briefly to Amy, Rachel, then closing with Nick.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I think, litigation, government action is valuable. Accountability matters. And I think that there, particularly over the last few years, there has been this, sort of a failure to at least see the impacts of accountability until fairly recently, because we're actually now starting to see accountability, particularly in the aftermath of January 6th. We had 4 years of DOJ civil rights work undermined and just a general lack of accountability. And so I don't want to discount the value of that. But we can't sue our way out of this process, out of this crisis. We can't prosecute our way out of this crisis. And so I wholeheartedly agree that this needs a whole of society approach, and particularly the role of the private sector, tech companies, and education on the front end to catch things that have just frankly gone on unchecked for so long is crucial. And I suspect in the coming months and years, we will start to see this become more and more integrated into the sort of fabric of our educational and social programs, or at least I hope that we will, because it has reached a crisis level that can't go ignored any longer.
Yeah, and I would just echo that whole of society approach, absolutely needed. Different angles, for different iterations of this problem. And I would just add that I really do hope that any proposed solutions, approaches to this issue is really driven by empirical evidence and data. We need to put more investment into understanding the problem, how it's manifesting, where it's manifesting, to really be strategic in how we approach it.
Thanks, Grant. I'll just close by saying that when I attended the Christchurch Call to Action Leaders Summit about a month ago, I screenshotted at a certain point just because I wanted to capture the Zoom box of the sort we're looking at with this session. That Zoom box really said it all. That Zoom box captured everything Amy, Rachel, and Mary just said in terms of being not only all of society, but every voice you can imagine being around the table to address and solve these questions. Above me on the Zoom box, you had the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Beside me, you had the President of France, but you also had senior tech executives, executive directors of tiny NGOs that are critically important voices in this work, and actually holding to account governments and tech companies as they pursue this work. You also had academic voices, and again, just a wide range of civil society voices. And everybody was on an equal footing in terms of the value they brought to the table in that conversation. And again, going back to Mary's reference to our shared government experience, that's something I never would have envisioned when I was thinking about my traditional career in national security, sitting around the White House Situation Room. But this is a wholly different problem set than what we were dealing with in that Situation Room context. And it requires a different approach in terms of the problem solving tools we're willing to count on and look to.
Likewise, I would not have expected 5 years ago to be sitting in this conversation with you all. I would have expected to be in other conversations about other security issues, but I am glad that we're here together. I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us here today. Nick, Rachel, Amy, and Mary, thank you so much for your time and insights.